Dr. James Boyd, thank you for turning your camera on. Oh, you turned it off. I'm going to encourage and invite everyone who is comfortable to turn on their camera so that we can feel as if we're in the workshop room together. I know it's not the same and all those things, and it would flow a little bit differently. However, it's always wonderful to have, thank you, Susan, to have faces to talk with, just as if we're in the room and we're having, you know, conversations around this. It's wonderful to be able to share like that. So I think we're filled. I think we're ready to go. Let me just, yeah, ready to go. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. And as I say, anybody would like to turn on their cameras, please do if you feel comfortable to do that. We'll get going. And let me just share my screen and oops. Oh, the host is Rhonda. You need to enable me to share my screen. Ah, fabulous. There we go. Great. So today's challenge, so we've got about 90 minutes and we're going to have a little 5-minute stretch break in the middle of it. And if we had more time and longer time, we would do a little bit of a breakout and have a conversation around a scenario that might be typical in one of your workplaces and with teams, and then have you come together and share that. But I think we might, it might be a better situation for an in-person one. So we're just holding it there and we'll see our timing. And if we have time, then Rhonda can flow everybody into a breakout. So today's challenge, and thank you for everyone for joining the session, thinking about and managing new workplace dynamics and realities. We're going to talk, I'm going to share a little bit about change, people and culture, workplace culture, learn about these emerging new priorities, and share a little bit more about people and our understanding of people, which is essential to reinventing the workplace and thinking about the workplace as a different, with a different leadership style and some different skills and competencies applied to the new workplace. And we're going to talk about psychological safety and share a little bit to give you some better understanding of what that is and how it shows up at work. And I'm going to leave you with some tips, practical tips for you to take away, and whether it's with apprentices you're working with, whether it's training journey people so that they can become better coaches. Any of those things, hopefully that I'll share can be applied in those contexts. So we're going to start with a poll, and Rhonda's going to share it and get it started. It's only 2 questions, so it shouldn't take too long. And it's just to set us up. And so have a look on your screen and your answer, just 2 questions, answer what you think is the best and most accurate answer to those questions. And you can just make your choice for each of the questions and then hit submit. And Rhonda's going to tell me when we're, I can't see the numbers, the rolling numbers, but Rhonda can see that, and she's going to share the results.
The votes are still streaming, and everybody make sure you get your votes in here. We're about halfway there.
Okay, sounds good. 50%.
All right, everyone, this is last call. If you'd like to get your votes in, we're still missing a few people, so friendly reminder to still try and get them in. Thank you.
All right, Rhonda, why don't we share the results? All right. My gosh, I might as well just stop now. You've got it all. Everybody knows. All right, I'm just leaving. No, I'm just kidding. Good. Thank you so much for sharing and for filling that in. Yes, the number one reason Canadians leave their job is workplace stress. So 1 in 4 Canadians, that's the number. So of every 4 Canadians, so it's the number one. And so it's things that we can change. And we do have to make some fundamental changes because I had mentioned the epidemic of stress in the workplace and in our lives with COVID. And so we had a lot of things that were happening prior to COVID. And then COVID just shone a light even stronger on it, as you know and I know. So workplace stress, and the second biggest influence on employee success and performance in their job is manager behavior. So that is something that we can change. Now, you can't eliminate all of the stress in the workplace, obviously, but what we can do, but there's a significant amount of and places to change and reduce and eliminate the stress that would otherwise be there. So thanks, Rhonda, for that. So I had mentioned with the keynote a little bit about workplace stress. So here's some stats just to help you understand a little bit more about this. And this was before COVID. So we're having lots of really good conversations around mental health right now in the workplace, which is really great because we're having conversations, and that's the first step. However, for Canadian workers, these are numbers from 2018, 2019. And the number one reason Canadians leave their job, the primary cause of workplace mental health concerns, and 70% of Canadians reported an increase in work-related pressure and stress over the last 5 years. And this is an interesting one from a senior leadership perspective, that only 23% of chief financial officers recognized that there was an increase in worker anxiety. So there's definitely a gap there, a gap in sort of recognizing and observing it because of the other demands on other people within the organization. And, there could be a number of reasons for that. And the top mental health issues in Canada are depression, anxiety, addictive behaviors, stress-related illness, and suicidal ideation. So I mentioned before that 4,000 Canadians every year die by suicide. So we have a huge issue, and the workplace has a very special role and influence in our lives, and we can do some things to change some of the workplace stress for workers and increase better places to work. But the new reality is we have to dig a little deeper, and we have to go deeper than we ever have, whether you're a manager, supervisor, a workplace leader, a trainer, integrating some of these things within new training, all of the training that we can for anyone that is going into the workplace, because there are a lot of factors that influence how someone is experiencing the workplace. And it's an individual concern, but it's also a collective concern. We are each responsible for our own mental health and our own well-being. And these are the 8 dimensions of well-being. So I use this because to invite you to think about, if we have, for example, an injury on the job, we have a certain baseline health up until that point. And then we have an injury, and it may be that we get better, we recover from that physical injury, and we go back to the way we were before. Or we can have injuries where it actually changes our baseline health, and we now have to learn new things. We have to learn to lift differently. We have to learn to live differently. And so all of these dimensions of our well-being can change where we are on that mental health continuum, and also create new things for us to think about and new things for us to learn. And I say that it's for us, and we are responsible for our well-being, but employers have obligations as well. And they have legal obligations, and they have responsibility for the well-being of employees. And there are some very specific legal ones depending on your jurisdiction. And psychological health has now, and it's a growing area, And in many jurisdictions in Canada, there's actually legislation now that supports employee and encourages from a legal perspective, employers to pay more attention to the impact of the workplace on the employee. And with the pandemic, there are some very concrete impacts that the pandemic has had on our well-being. And so those dimensions that I showed earlier, the 8 dimensions, these are 3 of them. So those are 3 of the 8 dimensions. So the impact is on our physical, our sleep patterns, fatigue, increased eating, drug, alcohol use, impaired memory, so cognitive function. And certainly pandemic fatigue and the pandemic in general has a lot of people, because we all have different circumstances, it's certainly not hitting everyone equally. From an emotional perspective, if you looked at some of the mental health, the Canadian Mental Health Association of Canada, talking about the level of sadness and stress and worry and anxiety that people are having because of the uncertainty. So that is having an impact on our emotional health, which is different than our mental health and our psychological health, which I'm going to get into a little bit later. So our emotional health, uncertainty and constantly feeling under threat. So it leads to difficulty managing our stress and our feelings of loss, depression, and stress. If stress is not addressed, it can actually develop into depression. And we are frustrated and irritable. And you may be seeing that in teams and crews in your own workplaces. And from an occupational perspective, it's no surprise that from a job and occupation, it's not just that people are losing their job and so they're having economic and financial implications to their well-being, that from a workplace perspective, work can be perceived as more demanding. And so when we're in these states and when we have a mental health issue, that it's maybe our workplace has not changed, but it's actually perceived it's real. Doing whatever job I had done feels more demanding. So you go home at the end of the day actually having more exhaustion, more brain fatigue, and the potential for burnout. And when we get to burnout, it can actually lead to us being less flexible. So less cooperative at work. We are resistant to following rules, difficulty making decisions, all of those things. So those are very important considerations in the workplace. So going through the pandemic. And there's a lot of research that's showing even after we come out of this, we are going to have to manage these going forward. So I want to talk a little bit about change. This is my favorite change graphic. You can identify yourself and place yourself anywhere on this particular model. So we have innovators, early adopters, the majority. So it's the early majority, the late majority, and then we have the laggards, and those are down with change. So anybody at any given time, depending on the issue, can fall within this. So we aren't all laggards and we aren't all innovators. It is a varied sort of mix. However, as you're thinking about change, whether it's a strategy or a new way of doing things, it's really a change, and we don't always appreciate the impact of change on people. A lot of project managers who are doing big projects, they are starting to do communications planning, but you still see the challenge with helping and supporting people to actually understand and adapt and become more flexible with change. And it's because we all had different reactions for different reasons at different times. So here are some change basics. So from a change perspective, there are things that matter, things you can control, and then there's that sweet spot, which is where you should focus on. So you have to start from where you are. Doesn't matter what kind of change, if we're talking about workplace reinvention or a new business practice or a new way of doing something or a new way of thinking. Start from where you are, because you're never going to start from scratch. So you need to understand even what your baseline is before you start to think about what is the shift. And thinking about what is within your control to change. And certainly from a well-being perspective, employees and people have a huge responsibility for their own well-being. But employers can help and support and influence that. And I put down no shaming, no blaming, because wherever we are in our lives, we've gotten here because of natural factors. If you think about anything in your life and you say, oh, here's where I am in my life, if you get probably some independent view of that, it's probably a natural outcome of some things and decisions you've made. It's not that you are happy that this is where you are, but if you dissected it, it would probably be a natural outcome. And it would be based on some of those decisions. So start from where you are, figure out your baseline, and then thinking about change within the organization. And change is about learning. So you're going to have to learn, you're going to have to unlearn. And unlearning is the hardest thing for humans to do. Because unlearning means letting go of things and ways that we've always done it. But from a change perspective, these are all the things you can think about within a workplace. And so this is a huge exhaustive list, but it's not completely exhaustive. So if you're thinking about we need to change and reinvent the way we work because we need to increase productivity, maybe it's motivation and engagement. Maybe we have to shift workplace culture. Maybe it's about workplace safety. Maybe it's the quality of the outcomes of the work crews working together. Maybe it is to improve our mental health and our well-being. But then the idea for this is then that's a particular goal, but then go down and get more and more specific as you go. And maybe it is because you know about the culture, but you really are starting to look at, are we really truly, both from our own vision and values, meeting the minimums, the legal minimums for psychological safety? And what does that look like at work? Maybe it's, yes, we want to increase in productivity, but we know we have an absenteeism problem. So you have to really start thinking about that and then addressing with interventions based on some of those things. But so really understanding what is it and what you want to change from a workplace perspective is the starting point. But the challenge is that people, they're the worst. They're just literally the worst. No, I'm not, just kidding. They're the most amazing. They're amazing. Like humans are amazing. But we typically, and this is just the human brain, we blanket and we have a lot of cognitive biases that we think that everyone's responding, and maybe not you, but the person beside you thinks like this, that everyone's responds like you, and everyone responds like has a same lived experience or has an interpretation that's the same. So the challenge for us, any leader, anybody who's trying to make some changes within a workplace, whether you're developing a new learning program or you're trying to shift attitudes and behavior, getting to understand people and some of the basic human components of what makes us human, especially if we're trying to do some things like nudging behavior. So using nudging theory, which we do some training on, nudging theory and to help behavior change, understanding how people actually respond really helps that. So if you're trying to get people to adhere to safety protocols, that using nudging theory, you can do that, but you have to understand people. And for this is Cookie Monster's, well, actually it was Oscar the Grouch was my favorite. But this is Cookie Monster, and I don't know if you noticed, but Cookie Monster's friend is giving him crackers. And yeah, it's like you don't even know me. So I encourage you more to think more about human behavior, because people are genuinely different, and it's not difference in the color of our skin or in our backgrounds, it's our personalities and our biology and our neurobiology. Those differences are also incredibly important, especially for behavior at work. So the best thing you can do is to do what is called, from an emotional intelligence perspective, reality testing. So every time you make a judgment in your own mind about something, and it could be something simple, but you make a judgment and you say, is that a fact? Do I actually know that? Or is that an assumption and I'm making a judgment? Interestingly, I was teaching a group of engineers last year, and I was testing them on the difference between judgments and facts. And they didn't fare so well, which was interesting to see. So we do our definitions of things and what we understand things to be, because we make some judgments and assumptions ourselves. But people are also basically the same, which is why you can create more universal change in a workplace. You can put things in place that will be psychologically safe for everyone. And then also ensure that if you have to make accommodations and other changes, you have to take those into consideration too for workplace change. So some of the things in a workplace, these are some of the conditions in a workplace that when we're talking about, okay, what's within your control to be able to make some changes on. These are from the research. These are the things that increase people's stress within the workplace and have a negative impact. So if there are behaviors and practices that even, checking in with, is that new policy actually creating some kind of isolation, social isolation? Alone without friends, no support, poor workload management, continuous uncertainty. So as a manager, skills in being able to not Pollyanna and have toxic positivity, but to create teams that say, okay, that's going to be difficult and it's going to be uncertain, but we can manage through this because we've done this before. And that is the new role of a manager. The coach is to help with self-efficacy, help build people who are more adaptable, that have adaptation skills, who are becoming more and more comfortable with having to be flexible at work. And that is the role of a manager. And then you can manage continuous uncertainty a lot better. And your stress level will actually be manageable. Lack of predictability in the workplace, scheduling and notice for scheduling, for example, is sometimes an easy fix for workplaces, because sometimes the manager might put out the schedule really at short notice. Well, that is the impact on an employee is very big from a stress perspective. So the manager will have to figure out how they actually change that behavior and that practice that is typical. And so those are some of the places that you can actually, within the control of the workplace, that you can have more observation and recognition of the impact of some of these things. When an employee has no control over their work, self-determination is incredibly important for humans. And that means autonomy, the freedom to choose and have some choice in how my work is done, how your work is done, and also the ability to grow and learn and do new things. Those are things from a self-determination perspective that are really important. So when you have a workplace that has a manager that has a different kind of leadership style, that is more directive, that actually increases stress for employees because they don't have any control in the workplace. And so no control over their work. If there's no limit and no end to it, that is why different practices on whether the project is finished, having sort of celebrations and closing components of it actually works on the human brain and increases people's comfort. So it's not, yes, the project may be huge and long, but dividing it up so that people understand, oh, this is the first phase, we're done, yay, let's have cake. And, that might be something you say, no, we don't actually have cake. However, it's about that recognition of that moment of closure. Workplace stress, so if there's a lack of cooperation, if the conflict within an organization is very high, then that's not going to resolve itself. That's a workplace intervention of some kind so that the workplace and the culture can go back to maybe hopefully a better place. If there's a lack of transparency, we are adults, everyone's an adult, we need to know more. We want to know more, we want to know why. And those workplaces that are really digging deep into that are going to be able to attract more people because that really matches up with our human basic needs. There are some other ones here, like limited support for growth. We all need to grow and learn and have some change because we want to have a rich work life. So taking care of some of those things. And when you have this negative impact on people, you have some negative impacts on the organization. So increased accident risk, negative health, physical, emotional, mental health, all of those things are impacted. So during COVID, part of the challenge is that all of us have been microdosing stress. And what happens when we are microdosing stress is that our nervous systems, our window of tolerance for our nervous systems actually is reduced and it stays stuck. And so it never goes back to really, you're in dysregulation, and then you have to go back to modulation, and then you have to be able to go back to rest and restore. And so if you're microdosing stress and chronic stress, then your window of tolerance is actually going to shrink. And when something that maybe a year ago wouldn't have bothered you, your level of tolerance is going to shrink. So you're going to be irritable. You're going to have all of those impacts. So you have to be thinking about how are you managing that stress and effectively managing it so that your nervous system doesn't get stuck. in survival mode, which it perceives it to be tiger, tiger. There is always a threat. And then our perception of the world shifts a little bit as well. You're probably familiar, I don't know how many people here use the standard, the national standard that was created in 2013. It's a universally recognized standard. The UK is recognizing it. There's a ton of resources. I think we're going to drop into the chat the link to the standard. Hopefully they're doing that. I know that this particular technology, someone has to drop it in or put it in a different place for you, for the platform. But there's a link there to the standard so that you can have a review. And there's tons and tons of good resources that are free for you to start understanding about these risk factors. So the standard outlines these as risk factors. And for any given workplace, not every one of these factors is in play or is a risk in your workplace, but these are evidence-based. If you take a look and better understand what these are, I like to take civility and respect, for example, certainly from a harassment and a bullying perspective, and also about psychological safety. The research shows that if there is a lack of civility, that is just a basic human need, then stress is going to increase and people are going to start to actually experience that they're not going to feel psychologically safe. If there's unpredictability where a manager one day does a certain thing and another day has a different view of the world, all of those things have an impact on someone's degree of psychological safety in the workplace. So these factors, and then if you were in a unionized environment, so I was speaking to the public sector, oh my goodness, the Public Sector Union of Canada, talking about this 14th factor. So in a unionized environment, and some unions want to ensure that there is another component that is available to them in conversations within the workplace. There may be a chronic stressor to this particular workplace because of the nature of the industry that is also a factor. And it's something that they observe, it's well known, it's repeated, and therefore they know that it's having an impact on the employees in terms of their psychological health and safety. I had shown this at in the keynote, which is the mental health continuum, self-check. You can Google this and you'll get a version of this. And I think we're going to drop it. It might've been dropped in the chat in the keynote. But if you take standard first aid, you'll get this version, which shares a lot more information about what are the moods that you can, what are the physical changes, what are the behavioral changes that might be at play. And then from a healthy, and then beyond that is thriving. And the research shows that only 20% of the American population would be considered thriving. So that just shows the level of issues around mental health in our populations. So thriving, and then healthy, reacting, injured, and ill. So obviously from a manager perspective, you're not a supervisor, you don't want to train managers, and you don't want to tell them that they are therapists. However, being observant about some of these things so you can have some candid conversations and you can show some caring is an incredibly important thing for a manager, because you need to show psychological support and that you observe and notice. And so these kinds of, this kind of information can be incredibly important to have those kind of conversations, especially if you start to normalize this and having this as a piece and a tool for team conversations and starting to become really familiar with the language around it. And people can use this in their families, with their kids, they can use it anywhere they want, but it's really about learning a bit more and all of the associated things to be able to be conscious and watch for. And it is a bit of a new day for managers. So whether you're interested in improving health incomes, productivity, or motivation, the biggest business opportunity, or whether you're a business owner, you're a contractor, and you own a business and you're trying to figure out, okay, where's the highest and best use of my time and my energy, or what should I be training my employees in? These are the highest and best. So reduce the negative impact of uncertainty. isolation, and chronic recurring workplace stressors. Those 3 things. And you know your business and you know your workplace and you know the sort of the temperament of the team, so you can probably identify those fairly quickly. And then increase the focus on the connections and relationships within, having positive, supportive relationships within the organization. And then manager competency, which you had just voted on. What is the biggest impact for employee success is around manager behavior and their competency. And so that is something that's incredibly important in learning new skills and new ways of observing, new ways of communicating, getting more access to their own emotional intelligence skills, be able to work with people, creating an environment of psychological safety and knowing what that looks like. And then thinking and understanding what our basic human needs are, which is trust, autonomy, work flexibility, belonging, connection, growth, enriched job. And one of the big things that you can, it's a little bit outside the scope of what we're doing here, but we do that as well, which is around psychological flexibility, which sounds like a big word, but it's really to increase competency around observing and making judgments and setting judgments aside and building more curiosity skills. So instead of going from, I know exactly what's happening, going, do I know exactly what's happening? That's around psychological flexibility. And how can I be curious about people? What do I need to know? Maybe I need to be better at asking questions, exploring things, having more curiosity about what's really happening with people, and then being more accurate at being able to take steps and make decisions. And everything at work is within this container. So this beautiful image is the container of culture. And understanding a bit more about culture will help you in how the culture forms. And it's really the result of values, decisions, and practices over time. And it's going to influence everything. And it is going to influence your business outcomes, employee well-being. It's going to influence any strategies that you have in play. And it's also going to be an influence on the level of cooperation and collaboration that happens within an organization. So there's a new job. It's like there's a new job to be done for anyone who is supervising people. And the shift is really, yes, there are skills and things that you can think about, but for some people, it is a mind shift where having a manager be more observant and mindful of an employee's whole life and their whole self. It is not the therapist role, but it is to be more appreciative that there are a lot of factors where people show up for work and they're impacting their ability to do their job and show up well at work. And so attuning to those kinds of things that are going on in people's lives, still respecting personal boundaries, but being much more in tune with that about things that are happening in their lives and how you can help in any way you can within the confines of policy and all of the things that you need to do. And sometimes it means unlearning, adopting, experimenting with ways of communicating and being with people and leading people and doing some more experimentation, especially if there's, for the last 20 years, you've done things in a certain way. Learning is the window and the door to that. The willingness first, then you build the capability. And that's the 2 things of motivation. Because the workplace and the manager role is the most important role in the organization. And if there are CEOs in the room, it's actually the managers and the supervisors. And your job is to support them in everything that they need. So helping them to keep them motivated so that they actually are working well with teams, help them build the capabilities they need, make sure that they have opportunity for growth and support. And in fact, in COVID, managers and the stress levels for managers and the pressures from 2 different. So I have to understand where the manager lives in an organization, or the journey person. So there are managers and there's apprentices, or there's employees. And so they're in the middle of all this. So they hold an incredibly important place. And I think they warrant more attention and more support, and remove any barriers and friction points for them to do their jobs well. So this is my own creation because I'm such a good artist, as you can see. So my question to you is, have you ever asked yourself, if I believe everything I think? Because, well, it's not a trick question, but you shouldn't, because our brains are built for prediction and they're built to protect us. That's what they're here for. So everything you think, so there is some things that you were thinking that actually are not, they might be feelings, real feelings you have, or real sort of outcomes of something that's happened and now you've interpreted it a certain way. But that is the way that our brain works. So it's about predicting so that it can keep us out of harm, and about protecting us. So our brains do all kinds of things. And so they give us thoughts, and our bodies give us thoughts, and they may or may not be the best thoughts and the most accurate interpretation of the world. So this little schematic is around actually how it actually works. So we all think that it's actually thoughts we have that come first, and that's not what comes first. So when you understand that, you think, okay, well, what comes first? Well, any given thing could come first. You could be afraid, and then you have an emotion that comes first. And feelings are built over time. And then we have thoughts. We might have moods, and then the moods. So this is a circle. And then we learn new facts, and then we make judgments, and then we come to conclusions. And all of this stuff works together to actually shape what we believe to be true. And then we make decisions, and we behave based on all of that. So holding your beliefs a little bit more softly is a really, really great strategy. For me, for example, just thinking about beliefs, and I toss it out to you, you can use it, you can toss it in the trash. I think of beliefs because we're learning so much more about the way things are, and the neurobiology, and about how we think and how we behave and the impact we have on others. I now am putting beliefs in a little softer place, and I call them now working theories. So what I might have believed before, I call it a working theory, and I will keep it as a working theory because tomorrow I might know more, and then I have to shift it a little bit. So I throw that out to you in case that's helpful to you, to help manage some of your own considerations in the way you view the world. Because we have all of this. This is the Cognitive Bias Codex. How awesome is this? Look at that. That's another brain picture. I know you're saying, Kim, for Christ's sake, don't show me any more brain pictures. I used to not be able to look at them because they grossed me out, but now I adore them. They're almost my favorite thing. I might have to get a tattoo. Actually, no, I can't. I have a 23-year-old daughter, and she has a number of tattoos, and I don't think she could stand it if her mother got a tattoo. So I guess I won't be doing that, or I might. It could be a little brain right here, just small. Okay, I digress. So this is the Cognitive Bias Codex. So you can Google this and find it. And because I share this with you, because we're human, these are all the biases that we develop that are available to us. That's not to say that you have every bias, but we are built, and biases are also helpful. They're neither negative or positive until they are making decisions. You are using them to make decisions that are harmful. So we have a bias. We can have a positive bias or a negative bias. I have a bias to mangoes versus oranges, for example. So I see mangoes everywhere. So when I go in the grocery store, mangoes. That's because I observe, and you observe what you care about. So I'm using that as it's a very funny example, probably. You think that's a weird example. However, it's around the fact that we build biases, and sometimes they're much more complex and more complicated than that. But we have them, and we have to understand that this is the realm of biases. And they're important for us because they keep us safe, and they help us we can make shorthand decisions on things. We don't have to use all that energy and brain power to be able to do things. That's sometimes what they're good for. But being more conscientious that we actually are there, it's the certainty challenge. When you are thinking to yourself, I'm absolutely certain I invite you to think about, am I really certain? And certainly the reason that certainty is so big in organizations and business and managers, because we've all been rewarded for being certain. Who's been rewarded for failing or being uncertain or having that view or having people view you as indecisive? Rarely is that the case unless people understand a little bit more that you are now, I don't know if I'm certain. I think I'll have to learn more. That, I'm hopeful, is a conversation that we can have in organizations, to be a little softer on that and to be a little more experimental and exploratory. But this is the cognitive bias codex. And to that idea about the mangoes that I mentioned, and just to try to help you understand how our brains work. So there's something called the RAS. And you've probably had this experience yourself. And I have a 2013 Nissan Versa on the screen here. I don't own it anymore, but I did own it. And this activating system in our brain is a bundle of nerves at our brainstem, and it filters out unnecessary information so the important stuff gets through. And it's the reason that we can learn a word and then start hearing it. We start hearing it everywhere. It's the reason that, you know, you might buy a silver 2013 Versa, never saw the car before, and you're starting to drive through the city or through town or through your community, and you think, oh my goodness, does everyone own a silver Versa? How come they're everywhere? That is our RAS in action. And it helps you tune out, my example is you tune out a crowd of people, and then someone says your name somewhere in the crowd, or maybe it's a voice of someone familiar, and there's all kinds of people talking, and you hear this particular tone of voice and you know exactly who it is, and then you can hear them in all of those voices. That is our brain working on our behalf by helping to sort and filter. And that's, our brains are most amazing things. Understanding how some of these things and why we observe certain things, for when some people say, well, I never noticed that there was something happening at work. Well, it's probably because it's not your experience, but that doesn't mean that it isn't happening. It's because you have not been attuned to it yet. So I'm inviting us to take a stretch break for a couple of minutes, which is stand up, stretch your arms. You can take a bio break for a couple of minutes, and I'm gonna just look at my clock because I do want, we sit, I think it's on average 10 hours a day, probably not for you if you're either doing training and maybe you have a different system, but maybe you're out doing jobs and you're in the community and you're actually out physically doing things, but an average of 10 hours is a pretty long time. And I even know 90 minutes is a long time. So take a stretch, and we'll come back in just a couple of minutes. Thanks for muting me. I was stretching. All right. I'm hoping everyone's back. I'm gonna look around and see if I can see any faces. It always just tells me that someone's back. I know you're all back. I'm sure you are. All right, on we go. Psychological safety at work. So from a psychological health and safety perspective, this isn't psychological safety and the law session. That's another one we do. But for psychological safety, everyone has roles and responsibilities at work. And from the organization as a whole to the employee, to a manager, supervisor, senior management, and then from a board perspective and a fiduciary duty. What I share here is some of the key responsibilities around that role. And from an employee perspective, this is the call to really start to understand yourself and what you are responding to at work and what impact you are having at work, that you have an openness to learning, that civility, respect, and professionalism, and the impact of that when you live that and you live your values, and what happens when you don't at work and the impact that might have on others. You also have a responsibility and it for yourself to speak up if something doesn't feel right at work, and to share that and with your manager and supervisor, and then so that collectively you can take action. And from a manager perspective, managers are implementing the policies that senior leadership and the organization itself has created, and becoming more skilled at communicating and leading people and leading change. And let's put that over there. Managers are applying all of those policies and responsible for the day-to-day experience of an employee. And so their role, as I mentioned, is incredibly important to an organization. So the notion of curiosity and setting the tone, if there are some challenges happening within the workplace, there needs to be some conversations around management. That is the radical truth, because employees' emotions and behavior are contagious. And that's why we need to sometimes have those honest conversations. And sometimes people are low self-monitors and they don't know the impact they're having. And they can be coached and they can learn new skills, and then they can evolve and get better. And we all, an openness to all of us learning. And we all do dumbass things and we all mess up. And having those conversations around accountability and understanding the impact that you have, and then figuring out how to do better, that's the only expectation we really have as we hold each other accountable at work. These are, as I mentioned, the 13 factors for risk that any organization, start from a manager, from the organization, as a tool for the organization, for senior leadership, and for managers and supervisors to understand the impact that these have on employees, and when and how you can actually have conversations and figure out putting practices and checking in and observing and figuring out where the risk is. You can do risk assessments around some of these things. And in the same way you have safety practices for physical safety, though psychological safety is different, and I wouldn't necessarily put it over to your OHS group. It is really a shared, it's leadership responsibility, and it's a shared responsibility for it. So there is, in the same way that you would implement other safety practices, you can put this in the same lens and start to put things in place. And there's lots of tools from the Mental Health Commission of Canada to do that. So this new job for the manager is really to better understand the ideas of mental health, well-being, psychological and emotional health. So here I just have a couple of definitions for you that and just because we use a lot of these words and they become interchanged and it gets a little messy. And so mental health and the mental health continuum I showed you earlier is that our mental health at any given time could be anywhere on that continuum based on something that's happened, based on our own health, our own physical health, some other things that have happened in those dimensions of well-being. And it can change. And at any given time, as I mentioned, one of those stats, which is 50% of us are going to experience a mental health illness. And some of the stats that we have are self-reporting. And we know that 1 in 5 Canadians have mental illness and mental health issues. But those numbers are probably a little bit stronger than that particular number. And you may know in your own families where there are issues and challenges for people. And from a workplace perspective, we have to understand that we have workplace legal obligations for accommodations. And learning more about that from a workplace is incredibly important. In fact, the landscape is changing, where physical health is certainly something we've been doing for 40 years, and we have all kinds of things in place. And so because we are now getting so much research from health providers and insurance providers about the costs and the impact of injuries, mental health injuries, there has been changes happening, and in some jurisdictions there is legislation around that. The definition of emotional and psychological well-being, it's really around processing. So it's our ability to process and interpret things. And so that's the difference between mental health. Mental health is a state on that continuum, and our ability, because of our own biology, our own lived experience, we have certain capacities and ability to interpret and process things accurately. And that's all from an individual perspective. From an organizational perspective, that's where we get into psychological safety and psychological health. So it's mental health and emotional and psychological well-being from an individual perspective. And then when we take those ideas into the realm of the organization, we're talking about psychological safety and the impacts of behavior and practices and policies. And from a workplace perspective, it's about meeting legal minimums. And then beyond that, if you have a great workplace culture and you want to do something that is even better than that, because you want to have high productivity, innovation, creativity, you want to do more than the legal minimum, then there are all kinds of things you can take those factors and really go in a much stronger and richer way and figure out, okay, well, we want to focus on this particular issue within our workplace. We have a great culture, but we want to really improve in this way. Then you can use the standard and there's great information on what kind of things, either from a learning perspective for your managers, from a workplace practices, and from a policy perspective. And that gets you to high performance and innovation at work. And as I mentioned about some of these things, that people are individuals and people are different, and yet we have shared characteristics. That's why from a psychological health and safety, you can universally apply some of the things that you can make decisions around, and some of the leader behaviors that are known to have positive impact on employee motivation, and some that are known to have negative impact. And so from a literacy perspective, when a workplace is psychologically safe, every reasonable effort has been made to reduce and prevent harm in the workplace. And when it's psychologically healthy, every reasonable effort is made to promote understanding, awareness, offer the resources and education around psychological health and safety. And why should anyone care about psychological safety now in the workplace? Well, these are the impacts when psychological safety is low. So when it's low safety, you have low trust, and you need to have high trust to actually get things done. It has a significant impact on mental health and stress, as I mentioned, but there are other impacts. For example, our fear, if we're in an environment where it is unpredictable and we can't predict our own psychological safety, then our fear triggers the self-censoring instinct. And the outcome of that is we collaborate less, we communicate less, we might withdraw. We might withdraw our effort so that we just do the minimums. Our motivation is going to be decreased, and our level of engagement is going to be decreased. And we share less, care less, which equals less cooperation within a team. When psychological safety is high, there is high trust, people are engaged, they take risks, they innovate, they're creative. And so if you have an environment where you want to solve problems and people have to be use their ingenuity and they have to come together and collaborate, then you need to have psychological health within your workplace. And you release something called discretionary effort. And you may know what discretionary effort is. It is when, for example, you pay me $20 an hour, and that's what you pay me. And so I do my work. I'm supposed to leave at 6 o'clock, but my colleague has to get home early. They have to go pick up their kid from daycare, or they have to take their kid to baseball, whatever it is. They are supposed to stay and finish up, do something on a job. And I say, no, you go ahead. I've got this. I got this. I'm good. I can go. I can finish this, whatever this is. I can do this. That is me offering my discretionary effort. And in organizations and work environments where there is a lot of change, you have to be agile, you have to be flexible, you have a lot of things that are impacting things, you need employees' discretionary effort. Because so you need those, that situation to have high trust, high psychological safety. And as I mentioned, for everything I seem to say, it is beyond awareness. And so digging deeper to understand different people's, the way their needs at work and how different things impact their lives at work, we need to go beyond just the standard of tradition and understand that different people have different responses based on a whole bunch of factors. And those factors are called intersectionality. And we have certainly seen during COVID, and certainly Black Lives Matter and other important events lately, how all of these considerations are not being discussed, and either in the workplace, certainly we've starting to see some societal change, but we have so much work to do. And we know we have a lot of work to do in the workplace to create understanding and appreciation for difference. Because unfortunately, workplace behavior is on a spectrum. So from healthy, psychologically healthy, amazing behavior, collaborative, supportive behavior, to a workplace that has, for whatever reason or a number of factors, there are behaviors that have become very harmful to both the environment, to certain people's individuals, or the entire culture overall. And so needing to address those is an imperative. It will not go away. Harmful impact will not repair itself unless you do make intentional interventions. And you have legal obligations as an employer to ensure that you have safety at work. And so thinking and understanding those kinds of things and having careful and honest and radical conversations about what's really happening when you get into some of those situations, and if there needs to be a formal intervention, doing it sooner rather than later, because it's not going to eliminate it unless obviously someone leaves. But even when someone leaves and that harmful behavior is removed from the organization, there are cultural remnants that remain. And so you may have experienced this yourself, where someone maybe who wasn't behaving appropriately at work has left, but for some reason there are still harmful behaviors going on, because our behavior, and we model and we collectively align to that. And we need to take a strong and firm understanding of it and make decisive decisions around it. Here's a little bit about, I'm sure you know all of the definitions of what discrimination is. So from an attitude perspective, this is where bias, these biases that I mentioned, why you need to consider your bias. Because if your bias is then informing a particular attitude about a particular group, and then it creates behavior and action, that's discrimination. So you have to understand that is how bias can really inform our behavior toward people. And the result of that if bias is left unchecked and you don't check it yourself and you aren't making some intentional strides to change the way you think about things, then it could potentially encourage stigma, stereotypes, which are harmful to lots of different groups in the workplace. And you're going to impact your workplace culture. And I think I mentioned this, that bullying, harassment, and toxic behaviors do not fix themselves. So I have a few final thoughts that I want to share with you. And then I wanted to open it up for questions and be happy to answer any questions you might have. So here's my advice on the top skills that you can start to think about in your own workplaces and the people that you work with. And one of them is really around mindset and thinking about it probably sounds, maybe it sounds a little hippy-dippy. I don't think so, because it's based on neuroscience and neurobiology. So I encourage you to try to, if that does feel, when you talk about mindfulness and presence, and we talk about our whole selves at work and about this culture of caring, I know for many of us, me included, I've had to intentionally learn all kinds of things about my impact in the world, and every single human has to do this. It is around making room for struggle and failure at work, and exploring your own self-awareness and about your impact and some of the things that maybe are leading you to make decisions or have a particular behavior. Maybe you do have a bias that you want to identify and figure out what that means and how that shows up at work. There is a need for more emphasis for managers around effective listening, curiosity, optimism. These are actually emotional intelligence skills that you can learn. You can learn to be more optimistic. Everyone has a temperament, but you can also practice and learn optimism, and you can learn curiosity and to be a better listener. Coaching adaptability and flexibility, that's the call, the challenge for managers today, versus micromanaging. Sometimes for us, we as humans, when we're under stress, we micromanage. That is a natural default for some people, in some circumstances. So trying to resist that and understand that you are actually, your job is to, as a manager, is to build capability and to build adaptability. And that's the manager, the new job to be done for a manager is a coach, and recognize employees and their basic needs. So when those practices and policies are in place that seem to limit freedom and some autonomy at work, that is going to increase stress and actually decrease motivation. So have more conversations that are relational versus transactional. And by that, I mean, it's about building relationships and connection with people, and including people, and creating, helping to create those connections at work, versus transactional, which is only task oriented. Engage people in solutions versus telling them. That seems second nature, but we had a client that we're working with and doing some work with last week, and they rarely involve the employees in some of the decision making that even impacts their lives. So it's certainly something that still happens. Help people do the things that make them happy and find joy at work. And when your strengths, your passions, and what you love, and all of those conditions come together, that's where you can find joy in your work. And hold conversations around psychological and emotional health. And the reason for this, and reason for making any change in the workplace, is because we can make workplaces amazing places to be. I've had that experience myself. I've also worked in organizations with workplaces that were on the harmful end of the spectrum, and everything in between. But we know that we can, if we work together and we actually start to continue to dig in to evolve our emotional intelligence skills and competencies, and also our lived experience, and blend those together. That's really good wisdom to apply in the workplace. So I thank you for your attention, and I'm going to end now, but I'm going to take a look in the chat. And Rhonda said if anyone had a question that she would capture it and throw it in the chat for us. So we'll see if anyone has a question for me.
No questions at this time, but if anybody wants to put a question in, now's your chance. You can just type it in the public session chat next to the video.
I'm dying for the tough question. I want the tough question, Rhonda. But back here tomorrow, it's like I'm playing here all week. So I'm back here tomorrow too. So, you know, if you want to come again to the same session, if I went too fast or if it was, I know it's a lot. It's a lot of probably some things you're very familiar with, probably some things that might be new. We're doing it again. We're doing it again tomorrow afternoon. So you get a chance to come again or go to other sessions, obviously.
Hi,
Thank
Kim.
you, Denise. Thank you, Denise, for that question. We have some research on this. So Deloitte has been doing some research and there, you know, it's still early days for some of the research on, because there's so many things that are happening from a COVID perspective. We are definitely having more conversations, and that's the beginning. But as I mentioned, information and conversations. What we haven't seen is taking it to the next level and making changes, because change is hard. And so change, actually behavior change, you have to go into a learning to actually change your behavior. And you need to change, you need willingness and awareness, and you need the capability to change. And so you have to learn, actually, you have to learn what the change is and learn the skills of that. And you have to actually learn change skills at the same time. And some traditional leadership and management and supervisor training doesn't actually tie those together. But there are better ways. So I think that people are having more conversations, and that's a positive thing. I think the more people who can, it takes a bit of bravery to have those conversations, especially in a place that maybe didn't have them before. They can hear them in the ether, you hear them in society, but they haven't come into the workplace. And we are having them, I think, more at a person-to-person with our friends, for sure, and some of the research shows that. But in the workplace, the change is taking longer. And that always is the case for any change. Societal change happens first. Workplaces are going to happen second. But we've never had a better time. The window is open for it. So the opportunity is now, I think, to raise the conversation. And I think it will only get better to start to have those conversations. So look for the wedge in the conversation, in the strategic agenda, as well as the everyday conversations. And the more people can share their lived experience, the better that other people will feel comfortable having the conversation. And then that's at the informal level, and then formalizing it as a part of annual workplace training. That's where we can actually make some real change. Do I have specific examples in the training sector? In their facility. Trainers and training managers, you have to build a module. You have to, you have to either, you can do things at you can add a module so that everyone can take mental health first aid, which I think is the most sort of the window of getting into the conversation. It's offered all across Canada at different places from the Mental Health Commission. And it is an amazing program, just the same way that we take standard first aid or CPR. So it's a good entry point. It's only the entry point, and it is around helping to start the conversation and to be more observant of what's happening within the workplace. It's not psychological health and safety in the workplace. It is about, as an individual and a manager, being aware and observing different moods and behaviors. And that is so that you can take action. So that's a good entry point. There are lots of consultants like ourselves and others who are building modules on psychological health and safety training and mental health awareness, stress literacy, all of those kinds of pieces. There's a whole host of areas depending on the focus of the training that you're, set the objectives. what is the learning objective that you want to create, and then build it or outsource it or gather it yourself so that you can meet that need. But I don't think in general, supervisor and manager training, it hasn't made, it's still specialized. And so you need people who understand it and have the background to be able to deliver it. But it can be woven into other training that's happening. It's absolutely, it can be discrete, and you can actually integrate it. I think the first step is, the question is, how can trainers and training managers address issues with mental health of learners in their facility? I think if all of your trainers and training managers have taken standard first aid, then that is going to give you certainly a base tool to be able to understand what might be happening for some of the people, your participants in your workplace. And then that's the other piece, is to go deeper even from your trainers and your managers, helping them their professional development. So mental health first aid to start, and then continuing on the path of additional modules to help them really deeply understand both the mental health of participants, as well as how to help participants when they go into the work environment, how they can actually build their own skills around understanding how cultures are built and how psychological health and safety is vital to the workforce. So I think it's two ways. One is the starting point is mental health first aid, and then having some conversations around learning objectives for those trainers and helping them with their own professional development. And then from a participant perspective, anyone who is being trained to go into the workforce needs to understand mental health, emotional and psychological health, and all those other things that we talked about a little bit in the keynote, and some of the issues we talked about today. And then hopefully we can have a tsunami of change. And I think that's the last question. Thank you all for your attention and for the questions. And I appreciate the opportunity to share the afternoon with you. And I'll see maybe some of you tomorrow afternoon. And if not, have a great rest of your day. And I hope you enjoy Candy Palmiter and all the other things that you have to do, get together with your colleagues. Take care. Bye-bye.